Dear students, we have now dealt with sex and gender, patriarchy and origin of patriarchy theories in module 17, 18 and 19. Now in module 20, we are dealing gender inequalities and the subordination of women. So gender inequalities are seen as a consequence of patriarchal system, and as a consequence of gender inequalities, women often confined to certain roles and certain status that we describe as a subordination of women. We will see this particular topic in following objectives. So the objectives of this module is to understand the concept of gender inequalities, to study the different forms of gender inequalities, to understand the forms of gender inequalities in India in particular, to understand the factors contributing to gender inequalities, also to understand the relationship between gender inequalities and subordination of women. So we look at these 5 important topics one by one in the next few slides. Before going to see the meaning and concept of gender inequality, it is important to understand what is equality and equity, and what is the difference between the equality and equity. Equality is often termed as a sameness. It means giving everyone the same thing and putting everybody at an equal platform and giving everybody an equal opportunities. But it only works if everyone starts from the same point. Everyone can be same only when everyone starts from the same point. But we know that in societies like India or any other societies, everyone is not equal and everyone is not started at the same point. There is an existing hierarchies in the society which evolved over the time through the civilizations. So there is an inherited inequalities in the societies. In such kind of societies, the concept of equality is not going to bring the equity. So what is this equity? Equity is the fairness, the access to same opportunities but giving advantage to the weaker one compared to their counterparts. We must first ensure equity before we can enjoy equality. So before giving equal opportunities, we need to see that everyone starts from the same point. If everyone is not starting from the same point, there is a necessity to promote the weaker compared to their other counterparts. So that exactly the same concept works in case of gender inequality, where women has been suppressed, women has been subordinated for over thousands of years, across the generations, across the civilizations. So the important concept here is for us is gender equity rather than gender equality. Another important technical concept we need to understand in this gender inequality module is what is within and between inequalities. Generally, the between inequality is the inequality between the male and female. But within inequality is within the female, the inequality across the other social identities, like in Indian case, across the caste, religion and economic class. So within the males, across the class, across the caste, across the religious affiliations, the difference. Same thing can be interpreted in case of female. Within female, inequality is inequality across the females, across the caste, religion and economic classes. So the overall inequality comprises of both within and between inequality. These two technical concepts, that is the difference between equality and equity, and the difference between within and between inequalities, and what comprises the overall gap, is important technical concept which one must understand before studying the gender inequality and women's subordination. With these words, I will now go to how we can see the gender inequality in a society. Gender inequality works in a vicious circle. If you look at this particular slide, we have given a lot of cyclic process in which gender inequality works. For example, though its starting point is a patriarchal society, the patriarchal culture, traits and traditions, which may initially lead to the different positions of women and different performances in terms of their roles and functions between male and female. Maybe that is the starting point, but it runs through a number of cyclic processes. The starting point for a vicious cycle of gender inequality is the patriarchal society. Then this patriarchal society leads to hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity means the men's dominance over female sexuality or femininity. Then this leads to gendered socialization. Means inculcating social processes where female has been always undermined, feminine has been always undermined compared to masculine. And this feeding has been given to the children across the societies, across the culture, to separately to male and female, where female sex is always undermined compared to male. This leads to power inequality between male and female. The power inequality and the roles, the performance of the roles of different sexualities. Then this again leads to the inequality in power, inequality and different gender socialization leads to inequality in access to various resources, whether it is economic resources, social resources, healthcare resources, which further leads to social, economic and health inequalities. And these social, economic and health inequalities further results in social reproduction of patriarchy. It means it further re-strengthens the patriarchy. That means it further strengthens the male, further strengthens the masculinity, which again gives more power to men to suppress the women. So this is again leads to re-strengthening of patriarchal society. So that's the reason why this we are calling is a cyclic process. So the gender inequality operates in a cyclic process. The gender inequality is a global phenomena. It is not just confined to India or confined to South Asia or confined to Central Asia. It is a global phenomena, but its forms and structures are operating in a different way, and it also in different levels and different forms. But its nature and intensities vary over time and place. The unequal status of women, deprivations, discriminations, as so on at different levels have been being major issues of gender inequality and women's subordination. Since the second of the 20th century, women have been struggling for their rights and empowerment by participating in social and political economic agencies. There are different forms of gender inequality, as already we have seen in the different slides, but now here if you look at this particular slide, we have put in 6 bullet points on either side of the gender inequality concept. Particularly if you look at the right side of this particular slide, then we are seeing the first important form of gender inequality is gender-based violence. Gender-based violence has been one of the dominant form of gender inequality, where women has been often prone to violent forms, violent experiences from their male counterparts. And often the second point is about the rights. Women often denied the basic rights. For example, if you look at the different life courses, in the initial stages, women has been denied of the basic household resources like food, nutrition, and sanitation. And also, if at the school going stages also, we have seen the lower school enrollment ratios for female compared to male. And also during the time of marriage, often females are denied of their marital rights, when to marry, whom to marry, and in the marriage decision making. And even after the marriage, women has been denied of decision making at various points of time, in terms of her health care, in terms of children's health care, and in terms of how to use their own earnings or household earnings. And there are also restrictions about their mobility. And another third point is cultural acceptance. Often women has been not allowed at many cultural functions. They are often devoid of cultural many participating in many cultural activities. And particularly if you look at the condition of women's status, of particularly the widows or divorced, is been denied many basic human rights. Then the left side, if you look at, then we have three other bullets. That is education. As I said already under the basic rights bullet, that women are denied of their basic right to education from the childhood and to the adolescent at various stages, of course. But as a consequence, women's outcomes in education is always, we have seen as compared to their male counterparts, women always have a lesser education compared to men at various levels. And even if women are going for schools and going for colleges, their enrollment into superior courses like the technical courses or technical education, their enrollment is much less compared to other courses. There is a clear segregation gender segregation in terms of courses enrolled by male and female. This always is, there is a gender inequality in education. And the same kind of segregation is also seen in terms of employment. Not only women has a lesser enrollment into employment and lesser enrollment into jobs, and their lesser participation of female labor force into the economy, but also their participation in mostly in the lower profile jobs and low paid jobs. Women is often paid less for the same work compared to men. Then we can also see women's lesser participation in the policy making and in political women's role as a political leader is also comparatively less. Overall, the government women's role participation in the government and governance and decision making is less compared to their male counterparts. So we see the women's government participation is less compared to men. Then the recognition for the gender inequality. When did we recognized that in particularly in historical process, where did gender inequality received a prominence? How the scholarly literature has identified this particular gap, gender gap. Particularly this literature, if you come to population studies, in the discipline of population studies, the literature goes back to 1917 when Eastern Boshrov came up with the book Women's Role in Economic Development for the first time to bring attention about the inequalities of knowledge and its far-reaching effects on lives of third world women. In the same year, the United Nations has adopted international development strategies of women and also observed the decade 1975 to 85 as the international decade for women. This is the beginning point of many feministic movements and the movements of women in development, then later subsequently women in development and gender in development. There are a number of subsequent movements have been initiated. But the major landmark, what we can say, is the adoption of Millennium Development Goals in Millennium Development Goals in 2000. In this Millennium Development, 8 main prominent 8 goals, the 3 goals which highlights about the gender inequality. Though the goal 3 on promote gender equality and empowerment of women is exclusively on promoting gender equality and women empowerment, but the goals like improvement in maternal health, which is also about especially giving importance to women and bringing women's empowerment and women's emancipation, that is, it also contributes to bringing gender inequality. And there is another goal on reducing child mortality, where we also talk about reducing the gap between the health status of both male and female. So these Millennium Development Goals especially highlighted the importance of gender inequality. In 1994, the ICPD conference, especially it highlighted the women's rights perspective. So from there, it led to the initiation of or inclusion of this gender inequality as a prominent developmental goal in the Millennium Development Goals. This is also followed by the Sustainable Development Goals, which also gives a huge importance to gender equality. Goal 5, particularly Goal 5 of the Sustainable Development Goal, which gives a space to how the different countries should work towards the improving gender inequality as a global or global sustainable goals or UN goals. Proposed SDG goals of gender inequality, especially Goal 3, good health and well-being, and Goal 5, achieve gender equality, social inclusion and human rights, are the specially focuses on this particular issue. But in what forms, especially in order to achieve the gender equality, it is important to know in what facets these are, like what are the forms of gender inequalities, what are the facets of gender inequalities. Here we are highlighting some of the important facets of some of the important forms of gender inequality. For example, the inequality in mortality. This is a basic disparities in survival. We know that female has biological advantage over male in terms of survivability, but in many countries, including India, the female is not able to achieve her biological capacity in terms of survival. Even up to 1990, female life expectancy was less compared to male. Only during 1990, particularly in India, female life expectancy took over male life expectancy. But still, in India, the female is not able to achieve her biological capacity in terms of survival chances or life expectancy. So, in this context, inequality in mortality is seen as one of the important gender inequalities. The mortality inequality has been observed in some regions of the world, but it is most prominent particularly in the South Asian countries unlike India. Although natural number of males at conception is higher than the female, keeping constant as sex-selective abortions after birth, the higher mortality rate for male become greater than female. In this way, the number of men and women equals at a middle to higher ages, if you particularly look at the life course perspective. However, the prevalence of female mortality is higher where the gender bias in maternal and child health care and nutrition were found to be higher compared to the regions where there is no gender bias. And there is also inequality at the time of birth, particularly at the time of we call it in demographic language, it is a natality, inequality in natality. Different forms of inequalities in society make parents wanting to have as a newborn as a boy rather than a girl. So there is also termed as a son preference. More of the parents want sons compared to daughters. This led to sex-selective abortions and elimination of female child even during the birth or before the birth. With the advancement of technologies, especially since the second half of the 20th century, parents could determine the sex of the fetus and go to the sex-selective abortions in many countries. The determination of sex and sex-relative abortions are prevalent in South and Southeast Asia, especially China, India and South Korea, but also in Singapore and Taiwan. The another important facets of gender inequality, which is also have showed in the few slides back, that in gender inequality in terms of education. Although gender inequality in schooling is observed in basic facilities such as schooling, as well as seen in developing countries, the gender inequality in professional training and access to higher education are found to be in some of the developing countries as well. So across the world, the gender inequality in education persists, but in developing countries it is much higher compared to in the developed countries. In developing countries, it is existed at all the levels, at the primary level, middle and higher education level, whereas in the developed countries it is more prominent in the higher education level. Particularly countries like Afghanistan, which officially excluded the girls from the registering in formal schools, although in the recent past the registration of girls has been increased, but it is really a pathetic situation in these countries. However, in many Asian and African countries and also in Latin American countries, the opportunity of schooling among girls is lesser than boys, and as a result there is a huge inequalities in gross and net enrollment ratios of girls and boys. There is also professional inequality. Women often faces a greater hardships to get an employment as well as promoted in their occupation, which is a low paid or low profile jobs compared to their male counterparts. A country like Japan, one of the most gender balanced country in the world, cares about the demographic dividend and its basic facilities, but the progress to elevate the levels of employment education is more problematic for women compared to men, even the countries like Japan, which is otherwise treated as one of the gender balanced country in Asia. But if you look at, like all forms of inequality, I feel the inequality in terms of ownership in the basic resources is the root of all gender inequalities. The ownership of, particularly ownership in inheritance, inequality, lack of inheritance rights to the female, or lack of ownership on critical household resources like ownership of house, land, and other important household resources. The ownership of property are often found to be undermined for women as compared to men. The undermined claims of women to properties as a society not only diminish the voice of women, but also make it difficult for them to enter and flourish in their economic commercial activities, in turn the political and social participation. So lack of ownership on the critical economic resources make them weak in terms both economically and politically and socially. For example, in India, the traditional property rights in male-dominated property is mostly dominated by male, but in the states of Kerala, there has been the matrilineal inheritance of property for a long time. So in the societies, particularly in few societies, which also few societies where there is a matrilineal societies, or where a matrilocal society which follows a matrilineality, where we have seen women having the property rights, and where we have also have an evidence that women's status is much better than men. So wherever the women have been given rights, or women have the better ownership of resources, we have seen better gender equality and the lesser gender gaps. And among not only the ownership of resources at the household level, at the outside household level, but also within the household level, there are a lot of inequalities. Particularly if you look at the son preference in decision making, and also the division of labor. Actually, women is often, we see in society with the patriarchal culture, women has often end up with the performing the double burden in terms of functions. They have also one side have a reproductive functions, and other also they have to sometimes do all kind of household based economic functions. They sometimes go to and participate in the fields and do the home based field work, fields, agriculture fields, and outside agriculture also they support the household economic activities, but apart from their basic reproductive functions, and but also takes care of household care, and not only cooking, child care, and other cleanliness work. So the women often at the household level is like end up in doing multiple work. This often leads to their lower powers, like giving lower powers to them, and participating are giving lower decision making opportunities to them, which makes their status vulnerable. They are more exposure to vulnerabilities, and where they may contact with more illnesses compared to their male counterparts. Then now come to that how gender inequality are related to women's subordination. But before relating these two concepts, it is important to see what is actually women's subordination all about. The concept of women's subordination, that we need to first learn. The women's subordination means the act of placing in a lower rank for a position. So the refusal to allow women to educate as a part of society's basic right is the subordination of women to men. So this is one simple example. So placing somebody at a lower position in each spheres of life is called subordination. Particularly placing women in a lower rank to men is women's subordination to men. In other words, the act of subordinating or making dependent or secondary, or the condition of being subordinated or made dependent or secondary or servant is the other languages which used to describe the women subordinates. What are the process of women's subordination? The gender inequalities in and lagging, gender inequalities in lagging behind of women in the economic dependence, health, education, and space in institutions and media also subordinate the status of women in society. So the important process of subordination of women is the economic dependence, lack of health care, lack of good health, illness, and also lack of education, lack of educational opportunities, lack of participation women in other institutions, lack of awareness, access to media, which all makes women vulnerable to be at the lower rank to men, and thus women always subordinate to men in the society and at the household. Apart from that, women are obliged to provide sexual services to their men according to their needs and desires. Often women denied the basic sexual rights. At the household level, the physical and mental and sexual violence are practiced in the male-dominated society. Interestingly, the women justify the violence as it happens due to some reasons which are the reflection of outreach of male domination in society. For example, in National Family Health Survey round 3, there are the questions asked that, are you justifying your husband beating if you have done any mistake? Then where the women from Uttar Pradesh, 98% of women from Uttar Pradesh is justifying their husband beating, shows the kind of status they have in the family. Learning and education system are formal institutionalized processes which assume to be controlled by men and which makes women more vulnerable. This male biased knowledge hegemony marginalizes the knowledge of women and expertise the aspirations as well. Then how do we measure the women's subordination in particularly gender analysis or gender mainstreaming processes? Particularly for gender planning, we need to measure the women's subordination. We use certain indices to calculate the women's subordination or women's lower rank to their male counterparts in the day-to-day monitoring of women's position or day-to-day monitoring of gender inequality. These indexes, which we will deal in other modules, but just I will name these modules names here. One is Gender Inequality Index, which we will discuss in the other modules. Then another important is the Gender Gap Index, which again we will deal in the other, but which I want to discuss on particularly the Social Institution and Gender Index. This is one index which we need to be discussed here itself. This index is a measure of discrimination against women in the social institution, including laws, both formal and informal social norms and practices. The index is comprised of 5 equal weighted sub-indices, in particular discriminatory family code, early marriage, parental authority in marriage, and divorce and inheritance rights of daughters and widows, restricted physical integrity, laws on domestic violence, rape and sexual harassment, attitudes towards violence, prevalence of violence in lifetime, unmet need for family planning, son bias, missing women and fertility preferences, restricted resources and assets, secure access to land, non-land assets and financial services, and limited civil liberty, access to public space, political voice and representation. These all indices are used to monitor the women's position or gender inequality and women's subordination. For example, if you look at the India's position in some of these indices across the world rankings, it shows how the gender inequality is more worse and which need to be a concern for the country like India. Gender inequality index, in terms of gender inequality index, India ranks 125 out of 187 countries. In terms of gender development index, India its position, particularly if you look at the India's rank, we can say that women has a huge disadvantaged position compared to men. Then global gender gap index, also India's rank is considered to be the worse compared to the many developing countries. India ranks 87 out of 144 countries. The Social Institution and Gender Inequality Index, also India has very low score. Gender inequalities in Indian case is basically in a consequence of traditional patriarchal structure of the society, which is basically comes from its traditional the culture and traditions which has been practiced over the generations. Therefore, to summing of it, gender inequalities and subordination for women go on parallel way. The gender differences often observed in male-dominated patriarchal societies. Gender differences could be understood in some particular form in general, specifically inequalities in mortality, natality, educational and professional skill attainment, basic opportunities, ownership status and family. In India, gender differences have been deeply rooted through the ages. Although some indicators of gender inequality have been reduced from last several decades, the difference in natality or sex ratio at birth has been tremendously biased towards them. Even the sex ratio at birth in India is continued to decline at several places. Some of the districts from in the 2011 census, which earlier showed better sex ratios, have been now sex ratio at birth is declining in these districts. The reduction of gender inequalities can improve the women's status in general and participation in socio-economic and political agencies in particular, which in turn reduce the subordination of women in society. An enhancement of women empowerment to expand not only the well-being of women but also men, including children and adults. Thank you. But this particular slide, this particular module, you need to be looked in conjunction with the other modules of the gender. Particularly in the next modules, particularly after this, we are going to deal on how do we use gender development, gender empowerment indexes can be constructed and used for monitoring women's status is very important to support this particular module. Thank you.